Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His mercy endures forever. Welcome back, everyone, friends far and wide, to Faith Matters with Phillip Campbell. This is a Catholic variety program broadcasting out here on Good Shepherd Catholic Radio in Jackson, Michigan. And I'm your host, Phillip Campbell, back to talk to you again for a half hour about anything and everything pertaining to the Catholic faith. One of the tricky things about being a conscientious Catholic in the contemporary social milieu is that we often find these situations where the ethical principles that the Catholic faith teaches us can intersect or come into conflict with different social trends or with legal matters, and there's all sorts of litigation and argumentation in the public sphere that's constantly going on about the way that that faith intersects with law, and all these fascinating different topics that kind of come out of that conflict. And so today, to talk about just one facet of this, I have with me Mr. Jason Negri. Jason is an attorney. He's a member of the State Bar of Michigan since 2003, and his personal practice specializes in wills, trusts, and small business needs. But I'm here to talk to him today about his work with the Patients' Rights Council. He is an associate director of the Patients' Rights Council. It's based in Steubenville, Ohio. And he's written articles that have appeared in Faith Magazine, Crisis Magazine, Columbia, which is the Knights of Columbus publication, and co-authored the booklet Freedom to Flourish, a Catholic Analysis of Doctor-Prescribed Suicide and Euthanasia. And he also speaks nationally on the practical and ethical aspects of end-of-life issues. So that's what we're going to be talking about today with Jason Negri, end-of-life issues. Jason, welcome to the program.
Thanks very much, Phil.
So I mentioned the Patients' Rights Council, the organization where you are an associate director. Can you tell us a little bit about the Patients' Rights Council? Why was it formed? What sorts of resources does it provide?
Sure. The Patients' Rights Council is the nation's oldest and largest organization devoted to protecting the rights of patients in all end-of-life situations, including cases involving the denial of wanted life-saving treatment that might be deemed futile by providers. We oppose euthanasia and assisted suicide as practices that abandon patients when they are most vulnerable, and we work against the spread of these practices, protecting patients' rights to compassionate care. You might say that we are the nation's largest pro-life group devoted exclusively to the end-of-life issues. Lots of other organizations, pro-life groups, they share our concerns and our positions on these, but they tend to be a lot more focused on other issues of import, whereas we focus specifically and exclusively on the end-of-life issues. We were founded in 1976 by our current executive director, Rita Marker, because she was getting active in pro-life work, and she didn't see anybody else as alarmed as she was by these specific threats that she saw coming. And it turns out that she was very prescient with that. She saw that these threats were starting to agitate, even though a lot of other people were getting very upset, and rightly so, by other issues like abortion. But she realized that nobody was speaking or pointing out the looming threat of assisted suicide and euthanasia that was coming.
I did not even realize that was on the radar in the 70s. Most people, I think, associate the beginning of the euthanasia movement with, like, Dr. Jack Kevorkian in the 1990s. What was going on in the 70s?
A lot of this stuff was kind of like the advance guard. It was the talking heads in academia and the public policymakers, largely in Europe. But there were some people here in America who were starting to pay attention. Derek Humphrey had started the what was deemed the Hemlock Society back at that point. And in the late 70s, he was the one listening to the people in Europe who were talking about this. That's really, they've been the vanguard of this movement, and even now, this is something that they auspiciously are ahead of us on. Because we're dealing largely with doctor-prescribed suicide and denial of care issues here in the States. We're not really dealing with anybody talking about legalizing euthanasia. Well, they certainly are over in Europe. They're about 20 to 30 years ahead of us, or behind us, if you will, on that curve.
Right. So, interesting that you mentioned that, because you said, there's all these organizations that are out there dedicated to focus on abortion and other pro-life issues. When most Catholics think of life issues or hear that phrase life issues, I think we do think of subjects relating to abortion, contraception, or beginning of life issues.
Right.
You mentioned euthanasia, but can you give us an idea of what's kind of the spectrum of the end of life issues that Catholics need to be aware of that are out there?
Really, it's the big three, and I mentioned them: assisted suicide, euthanasia, and denial of care. So euthanasia, of course, is when you actively and affirmatively take somebody else's life, ostensibly out of compassion for their suffering. And that's not really on the table here in America. We still, thank God, have a societal, visceral response against that idea of somebody else doing that. But they're very much facing it in Europe, and there are a number of nations right now that are we're seeing headlines coming out of people being euthanized against their will. You know, it always starts with somebody saying that, well, this is what they want, and they articulate that desire supposedly while they're competent during their lifetime. And then later on, when they reach whatever point they predicted they wouldn't want to live anymore, then the doctor comes with the lethal injection and dispatches them efficiently, shall we say.
Right.
Well, that's not really the case here in America. Our threats are the other two. Doctor-prescribed suicide, also called assisted suicide. That's probably the biggest end-of-life issue here in America right now when we're talking about a legal battle. 9 states so far have affirmatively transformed the crime of assisting a suicide into a medical treatment. Even though those are the only 9 states that have done it, every single year you see anywhere from 20 to 25 states introducing legislation to try to accomplish this, because the people on the other side, the group that I mentioned that was formed by Derek Humphrey, that originally was called the Hemlock Society, well, their polling determined that wasn't a very palatable name, so they call themselves Compassion and Choices now. They've changed their name a number of years ago because, of course, who can argue with compassion?
Right.
So they position themselves as arguing for end-of-life choices and giving people just the option, the legal option, to have their doctor assist them in killing themselves when the time comes. Many states have still managed to hold the line every year when this comes up. It actually was introduced in Michigan 2 years ago, and repeatedly is introduced in all of these states. It didn't used to be that way. Prior to 10 years ago, we're talking maybe 5 to 8 states per year you'd see it come up. And they're the fringe states where the leftist elements were strongest and where they could find a receptive audience in their legislatures.
Right.
But something changed about 10 years ago, and they got a big influx of money, and they've really been very, very aggressive in trying to change public opinion. And of course, like with everything else, they do it incrementally. They soften people up. They tell the really awful stories about people who are truly in bad suffering type situations, and they make people feel so sorry for them that, of course, you want to do something to alleviate their suffering. And their next step, the option they offer, of course, is offering them the lethal injection by their doctor, or the pill, or something.
Now, I mean, I don't know much about. I'm not a medical expert, but I'd heard several years ago a physician speaking on this subject said that where the state of medicine is today, that palliative care, that is prescriptions for pain, is almost able to mitigate any sort of suffering that a patient can experience, and that if you're looking at it in terms of pain and suffering, there's no real justifications for a person taking their life simply because of physical pain. Would you agree with that?
I would. Again, I'm also not a doctor, but from my understanding and my reading on the subject, yes, pain control and management has advanced to such a point where pretty much any pain can be alleviated with proper treatment and medication by a board-certified pain specialist. Far too many doctors have patients who are experiencing chronic pain, but the doctors themselves don't necessarily know that this specific approach, which analgesic to use for this specific type of condition, with the result that far too many people in America, in our midst, are walking around in chronic pain. And if you've ever had that condition yourself, even temporarily, a pinched nerve or a cracked rib like I've had, it's terrible. It changes the way you think, the way you interact with people. You do become a lot more closed off and hardened and dour. It definitely has its effect on people. So I totally understand why somebody in that position is feeling so desperate that they just feel like they need any way out. But instead of offering them the pain relief they need, people are starting to offer them assisted suicide as if that were a better option. And that's the problem.
Let me ask you this. I don't want to put too much of a tinfoil hat on or get into conspiracy theories, but when you start bringing up this subject, talking about what a lot of these people just need is effective pain relief, one can't help but wonder the old legal principle cui bono, who benefits, right? And is there a push? These people that are giving money to these assisted suicide organizations, where do insurance companies fall in? There's always I think a suspicion that it's in the insurance company's interest to get people off the rolls as much as they can, rather than long, potentially expensive treatments.
Right. I don't. Right now, what you're saying is certainly true in terms of the suspicion that we wouldn't be surprised to find out that the people with the money interest in this are the ones who are advocating for it. Mm-hmm. Strangely enough, that doesn't seem to be the case with this issue. We have looked into it, and the insurance companies, I think because they are hyper aware of the scrutiny that they're under,
yep.
and they're always being portrayed as the penny pinchers who are trying to cut people off from treatment. They are not actually the money behind this. It does seem to be really based on autonomy. So far, a lot of the strongest voices and the money supporting this movement are all agitating for it in the name of personal autonomy. That they don't want to suffer, and they don't want their loved ones to have to suffer. But the founder of the Hemlock Society, Derek Humphrey, who's like the grandfather of the assisted suicide movement here in America, he said way back when, and at these conferences that I mentioned that were taking place back in Europe in the 1970s, the common idea was that the search for cost containment is what is going to finally drive assisted suicide to the point of acceptability in America. And we certainly see that whether it's the insurance companies or now with the Affordable Care Act and the government entities taking over certain aspects of health insurance, they're certainly looking to save money, ration care. There's no doubt that they are going to benefit from just having these chronically ill and sick people or the disabled removed from their roles.
Right. Now, I know this is still kind of unfolding, but have you seen more of these end-of-life questions come to the fore in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, things that have been going on in nursing homes and hospitals? How has this affected the public perception of this, or any legal issues, if at all?
I think, well, an obvious case is the more high-profile case of Michael Hickson, a 46-year-old disabled man in Texas. He was disabled from an incident that happened about 4 or 5 years ago, was a quadriplegic. He contracted coronavirus earlier this year and had some complications. Mm-hmm. And as a result of that, the upshot was that he was actually denied basic care. He was denied food and water and left to die, even over the objections of his wife. Part of the reason this took place is because it happened in Texas. And Texas is one of 2 states that have futile care laws, as they're sometimes called, where if the hospital deems that a patient's care is futile, they can affirmatively and unilaterally make the decision to take over the patient's care decisions, even over the objections of family members. And this is one of those cases where that happened. The hospital made the call. They didn't think that Mr. Hickson's life was worth preserving. He didn't have a high enough quality of life. So they just removed his care and removed his food and water, and he essentially dehydrated to death after a couple of days.
It's
so
a very...
that's the most high-profile, the most acute case of it. But in a broader sense, I think we all saw the effect that the coronavirus scare had on our society. There was definitely a nexus there, because when the demand for ICU beds was very high, when our critical care staff was overburdened and we were told we had to flatten the curve so we didn't overwhelm the medical care system, worse than it already was. Well, when medical resources are scarce, a triage situation necessarily arises, right? Judgment calls have to be made regarding who's going to get care and who isn't. Now, this can be a normal and necessary thing because resources are limited. They are finite. We don't have infinite medical resources to take care of everybody's needs and wants.
Sure.
Problems arise when you look at the criteria that are being used to decide who gets care and who doesn't. When you're on the battlefield and you've got to make a split-second decision in a triage situation, yes, you make a decision based upon who's actually going to benefit from the limited resources you have. If somebody's wounds are so bad that they're going to die regardless of what you do, you feel bad, but you cannot, as they say, waste resources on somebody in a situation like that. And that has to be done. That's normal and natural. Analogously, when you've got a COVID situation and you've got to determine who's getting medical care and who isn't, you have to look at the patient's health and recoverability. Those are relevant criteria.
Right.
But what we saw happening is people were starting to take other factors into account, whether it's age or gender, disability status, Some lives are just unfortunately being seen as being less valuable than others, and it's a very subjective quality of life standard that is often imposed on the decision-making process. That's very problematic.
Right. So, for example, you could have a 68-year-old man who's suffering from COVID and complications. He could have a very real chance of recovery if he had those resources allocated to him based on his actual medical condition. But looking at his age, they might say, here's a 68-year-old man, here's a 33-year-old man. If we give it to the younger person, they're going to recover, they're going to have a longer life. This older person, he might have been close to death anyway. This other person takes priority.
Right. That's an example of the sort of problems that were arising with this. And I don't want to sound like I'm impugning blame to the people who are in those crisis situations who have to make those decisions, because the decisions have to be made. Maybe you've only got one ventilator, and you've got to choose between the 30-year-old patient and the 68-year-old patient.
Yep.
I'm just saying that from a global perspective, the overarching bird's eye view, somebody is determining what criteria matter.
And those criteria aren't necessarily medical.
Correct. That's exactly it. It bleeds over into people's views of whether or not the person has a reasonable or good quality of life. And like I said, it's very subjective, and it does tend to discriminate against the medically vulnerable.
Now, I want you to lay out a distinction for us. I think you hinted at it earlier, but people often, when they think about being kept alive in a medically vulnerable situation, they'll say, like, well, I don't want to be hooked up to all these machines that are breathing for me, stimulating my brain with all all these extraordinary circumstances. But often when we're talking about denial of care, that's not what we're talking about. There's a distinction between what they would call extraordinary means and just your routine sustenance. And I think people don't understand the distinction that between these two. Can you lay that out for us?
Yes, and you've hit upon one of the confusions that a lot of people do have. When people are talking about not wanting to be, quote, kept alive by machines, and I hear that all the time in my law practice. Mm-hmm. I meet with people who are doing their wills and their powers of attorney. 90% of them say some form of that. They'll blithely say, well, if I'm in a condition like that, just pull the plug. And they don't make the distinction in our conversation which plug they're talking about.
Right.
Because certainly there is a moral calculus to be used. And we see this even in the U.S. bishops' ERDs, the ethical and religious directives. They recognize that in these situations, yes, there is a calculus to use. If the burden of the proposed treatment reasonably outweighs the benefit you can expect to get from the treatment, then the treatment is not obligatory. We're not obliged to pursue every single medical treatment and therapeutic that's out there in the hope that it's going to make us a little bit better. That is not at all required. And the example of a respirator is a prime example. If a patient is unconscious with no reasonable hope of regaining awareness no matter what is done, and the respirator is literally doing their breathing for them because their lungs aren't working anymore or their brainstem has shut down, it is perfectly legitimate and reasonable to remove the extraordinary function of the respirator that is literally keeping them alive.
Right.
And most people, nowadays at least, choose to do that. If they're able to approach it rationally and they think about the situation, the vast majority of people that I talk to at least, that's their starting position when they come in. But they don't make those distinctions, and that's why we have to have those deeper conversations when I talk to my clients and we write down on paper what it is they want, because they tend to conflate that with removing something like feeding. If you're getting food and water through a J-tube or some other type of, quote, artificial means, well, that doesn't change the nature of what's being introduced. It's still just food and water. It's not meant to make you better. It's meant to keep you alive normatively.
Right.
And that's the problem, is people tend to say, well, yeah, just, take me off everything and let me die. Well, no, strictly speaking, if you take away food and water, you are not letting somebody die. You are starving them to death, or more accurately, dehydrating them to death, because that usually happens first.
Yeah, that was how my own grandfather ended his life 20 years ago. He had a stroke and was in a coma for a certain amount of time, and I don't know the calculus that went into it. But he was unconscious in a coma, but he was breathing on his own, and but at some point someone made the decision to take away his food and water, and he just kind of lingered for a week and died from just denial of just basic sustenance. And you're right, that is not just letting them die. That's actually killing someone, which is why that's different than taking away extraordinary means like the ventilator.
Right, and the terminology you used, extraordinary versus ordinary, that is very helpful. And sometimes it can be subjective. We're only talking about, I think, the two most obvious cases of extraordinary being the respirator versus ordinary being the food and water. There may be any number of medical conditions that you really do have to look at and make that moral calculus and see. And there's a multiplicity of actual medical facts that might weigh upon that, which is why it's better to deal in principles than hard and fast, if this, then that, if this, then that.
Now, many people do not think about end-of-life matters until they're actually faced with these decisions. Like a lot of times, the first time this is being discussed is when there's a crisis situation, the family's in the hospital. For our listeners, for Catholics particularly, what are some, I guess maybe unanticipated end-of-life legal matters that people need to be cognizant of and prepare for ahead of time?
You've hit upon an unfortunate reality. A lot of people in America, I think the latest statistic I heard was 70% of American adults do not have their estate plan done. And when people hear estate plan, most of them think of a will, which is, of course, probably the most obvious and famous of the documents. But a will simply disposes of your stuff, right? It says who's going to get your things when you're gone.
We need to know who's going to dispose of you.
Right. One of the other documents that people don't talk about enough is the medical power of attorney, right? Durable power of attorney for health care. The term living will is thrown around a lot. Well, Michigan, at least, does not recognize a living will document. And it's worth making the point here, I think. It's an important distinction. A living will tries to set out in advance medical care that you do or do not want when the time comes. And it's kind of like a blank check to your doctors and medical staff to say, do this, do that. Well, the problem is you may know what you mean when you talk about ordinary care, but you don't know how your doctor's going to interpret that. You don't know who your attending physician is going to be. You could be in an emergency situation halfway across the state and be in a hospital that you have no familiarity with. You don't know how the doctor's going to interpret your living will.
Right.
The best way to do it, and that's one of the reasons why Michigan doesn't recognize a living will, but what we do recognize is the durable power of attorney for health care, which identifies and names a trusted decision maker for you who can assess the totality of the circumstances that you're facing and make that judgment call as you would want them to make it. And the best thing is to have those all-important conversations while you're still alive with your trusted decision makers, with your loved ones, and then maybe put those decisions and those guidelines down on paper in the context of a durable power of attorney for health care, which is the legally recognized document that will require the doctors to take their orders from whoever you designate. And that's what every adult should have one of those in place.
Right, and to do that far in advance of, you can't predict when you're going to need something like that.
That is true. But most people, like everything else, they put it off. Oh, I'll get to it. It simply isn't a priority, again, until they're in a crisis situation. Most of the calls I get are from people when a family member dies. They say, you know what, I got to get this taken care of now.
And for our listeners in Michigan or abroad, Jason is capable of handling those things for you. You can visit his website at www.jasonnegri.com. That's Jason Negri is Negri.com. This is one of the focuses of Jason's legal practice. Jason, a bit earlier you mentioned that we're under no obligation to explore every possible medical treatment that might make us a little bit better. From time to time you hear these stories, woman has cancer, maybe she's already had it several times. She gets diagnosed with it again for the third time, and she says, you know what, I'm not going to do the chemo this time. I don't want to go through the sickness, the losing my hair. Like I've just to extend my life another 2 years, I'm just going to let the disease take its course. Is that an ethical decision that a person can make according to the Catholic understanding of this?
Yes, absolutely it is.
Right.
And that the last part of that, what you said, really is the distinguishing factor. It's the benefit versus burden analysis vis-a-vis the patient, right? Not the hospital, not the insurance company, not the care staff or the family members. It's to the patient. And if the patient assesses the situation and they deem that for themselves the burden outweighs the proposed benefit, they can completely, legitimately, ethically refuse that proposed treatment and say, you know what, I'm not going to do it. I'm done.
Right, and there is a big ethical difference between just saying I'm letting a fatal disease take its course versus I'm going to intentionally cut off a viable life.
That is absolutely a huge difference. And I will say, I actually attended a Compassion and Choices national conference a couple of years ago in Chicago. I wanted to see what the other side was talking about. So I registered. I didn't, of course, disclose my affiliation with the Patients' Rights Council. I simply registered as an estate planning attorney in Michigan who's interested in these issues. So for 4 days in Chicago, I'm attending these seminars and hearing these speakers, and the biggest takeaway I got from that was that so many of the people there were motivated by their concern for overtreatment because they had family members who died lingering deaths because they were receiving all sorts of medical therapeutics and interventions and treatments. And they chose to do this because they felt like they had to, or felt, hope springs eternal, right? They wanted to pursue something, anything that was going to make them better, regardless of the burden that it placed on them, whether it was financial or medical or anything else. And so the family members see these loved ones lingering and suffering, perhaps far beyond what they otherwise would have if they had just ceased the treatment, if they had just taken the time to soberly square with their mortality and look at the situation and say, you know what, I don't think I'm going to do this. I'm going to forego this treatment. And they could have been kept comfortable and just died naturally.
Right.
But instead of that, so many people pursue all of these treatments, which if you actually ask doctors honestly and objectively, many of them will admit, yeah, these treatments were obliged to offer them, but if you ask my opinion, no, this is not worth it.
Right.
There's no point. That's why and even from a very pragmatic financial point of view, so much of the cost of disease treatment in America is in the last 6 months of a patient's life.
Yeah.
Because they keep trying all of these things in what is actually a vain attempt to get better, when if they could just allow themselves to forego the treatment and approach their death with maturity, they wouldn't have to linger on, hooked up to machines, dying in hospitals in agony, as they say.
That's an interesting. We have to go in a minute here, but that's just an interesting kind of starts crossing over into questions of philosophy and why is it that in contemporary society people are so petrified of being able to face death. But at any rate, Jason, this was some real interesting stuff. I'm disappointed the half hour is over already. We'll try to get you back again on sometime if you're willing to come back. Yeah. And is your website the best way for people to get in touch with you if they want to follow up?
Yes, my website for estate planning purposes, and then certainly the Patients' Rights Council website for just a ton of information about these end-of-life issues in general, and that's www.patientsrightscouncil.org. Okay,
very good. Jason, thank you very much.
Thank you, Phil. Take care.
And thank you all out there for listening. This has been Faith Matters with Phillip Campbell. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord let his face shine upon you and be gracious unto you. The Lord look upon you kindly and give you peace.